I have a story for you called Call Me Charlie. Charles John Lambourne, Call Me Charlie, was standing outside Caersus railway station in his Sunday best, though it wasn't Sunday. He had a new collar on, which was very uncomfortable. In his buttonhole he had a single red rose, and he carried a bouquet of freesias. He'd come up from Oswestry a couple of hours ago on the early train, and the next train back was in 20 minutes. He kept looking at his pocket watch. Was she going to come? She'd said she would come. And she'd also said, don't come up to the house. I will come down to you at the station. He pulled out his pocket watch again, and looked at it and shook it. And was it working? He must buy a decent one. He put it back in his pocket and ran a finger along his new collar. He'd been to the house before, obviously. He'd spoken to her parents. He'd been honest. He'd laid all his cards out on the table. He loved their daughter. He was a fireman for the Great Western Railway, God's wonderful railway. He had prospects. He was halfway to becoming a train driver. Only a station master was more important. And the GWR looked after its employees. There'd be good wages. There'd be a small cottage. There'd be a pension. And if the worst came to the worst, the widow would not lack for any support. And the children, if they wanted jobs, there would be jobs at the Great Western Railway. He also admitted that he liked going to football. On a Saturday, he watched Oswestry Town. He was very fervent. He liked to shout at the referee a lot. He didn't drink, no more than anybody else. He went down to the Cambrian Railway Club once a week for a pint and a game of dominoes. Oh, and yes, he was a staunch union man. And yes, they did call him Red Charlie. He was a convener, but it was important. Railways were dangerous places. People died. You had to have proper regulations. No, and they turned him down flat. He suspected it was something else. It could have been that because he was English, but surely not. But as he walked back down to Caersus station to get back to Oswestry, he put that out of his mind. The answer had been no, and that was that. This is what happens in life. He would get on with it. He had an early start tomorrow morning. But a couple of days later, he'd received a very simple telegram. It said, ring this number at 7 o'clock next Tuesday. You're Beatty. He was fascinated by this. He rang the number. It was a public call box, and there she was. And that's how they continued their courtship. If you're still interested, Charlie, she said, I'm 18 within the year, and then I can decide myself. That's only if you're prepared to hang on and wait for me. Are you? Of course he was. And that was their courtship. They didn't meet. There were these phone calls, different times, different days, so that nobody knew what was going on. And then the plan. And the plan was for the 18th birthday, which was today. He pulled out his pocket watch. Was she coming? Did she have second thoughts? He would have to go back to Oswestry again. He looked at his watch again. Was it moving? Was it the train was steaming up? He heard it hoot. It was going in 5 minutes. And then he turned, and there she was, hurrying down the station road towards him with a suitcase in her hand and a big smile on her face. They kissed and embraced and raced for the train. First class carriage, of course. Charlie had never travelled first class. He'd been in the front of the train, shoveling coal, but he never travelled first class. It was strange. Back in Oswestry, they got a cab to the licence office. There were a couple of witnesses there. He bought them a drink. Their wedding night was at the Windstay Hotel in Oswestry, the only hotel with stars. And the following day, they both carried their suitcases and walked the 3 miles to their new home. It was a GWR railwayman's cottage, 3 up, 3 down, a kitchen, a front room, a parlour. And this is how they began their life. Charlie was working towards his becoming a train driver, engineer. And BT, well, she was a seamstress, a tailoress. There was a job just across the road in a clothing factory, but she was too well qualified. But they gave her a job in quality control because only somebody like her could spot there was something wrong with something and then fix it straight away. And they were very flexible about the hours. So when children came along, work could be fitted around that. And 4 children came. First was a daughter, and then 3 sons. And then the war intervened. Being a protected occupation, Charlie drove ammunition trains. When he knew that the train was going past their house, he would let the children know, and they would stand by the railway line, and he would slow the train down and throw a few lumps of coal. It was strictly forbidden, of course, but everybody did it. He had 3 allotments. They had rabbits at the bottom of the garden for food. They had a breeding pair called Mr. and Mrs. Churchill. And when times were hard, Charlie would put on his dark coat and pick up his sack and go out for a mooch. He explained that it was helping the farmer by thinning out the crops. So he would come home with the thinnings of turnips and carrots. It was strictly forbidden, of course, but everybody did that. And they survived the war. BT no longer made clothes. It was switched to army uniforms and parachutes. But the war ended, and Mr. Attlee had promised them a land fit for heroes if you worked. And Charlie determined that he would get his certificate. The front room they converted into a workroom for the children so that they would do their homework properly. And to make sure they did, he would sit in there on the rocking chair reading the Oswestry Advertiser while they did their homework. And if it was especially cold and the children were wearing gloves to do their homework, well, he noticed these things and he would lay a fire for them. And 15 years later, the efforts and hard work and sacrifices of Charlie and BT came to fruition. Their daughter became a hairdresser. She had a certificate and everything. She got married to a sergeant from the local artillery barracks. She then spent the next 15 years traveling around the world, Malaya, Germany. She had 5 children, the first of whom was born upstairs in the front room at Oswestry. He slept in the pulled-out drawer of the tall boy on his first night. And the son, the eldest son, Lai, well, he did his national service in the Royal Air Force and spent the 2 years drawing half-naked women on the front fuselages of aircraft. Turned out he was very good at it. And he was offered a job at a prestigious factory in Loughborough, the Brush, as a senior draftsman. And their second son, Malcolm, well, he stayed at home. He married Marjorie, who was a supervisor at the post office, and he became a plumber. Had started his own business, fitting, what was it, those funny things? Central heating. Yes, he was becoming all the rage. He was working on fitting central heating. And their youngest son, Michael, well, he was a scientist working for the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, Minavag, as he called it. They'd done well. Charlie had become a train driver, and they could look back and relax about life and as the children moved away. And then retirement zoomed. 6 months to go, he'd done 30 years. He couldn't believe it had passed by so quickly. 6 months to retirement. Some officials came from the railway board It was British Rail now, not GWR. And they explained there'd be no problem with the house. They could stay there. There'd be a good pension, even a lump sum, which they could use to buy the house at a discount if they wished. And the pension was very generous. And if the worst should happen, heaven forfend, his widow would be taken care of. And there was just the one thing they needed to talk about, and that was the gold pocket watch to commemorate his 30 years. They brought 6 with them. He had to choose one, and they'd agree for the engraving that went on the back. Well, he didn't choose the largest, the gold one. He chose the middle one. He looked inside, he looked at the movement. He wanted something really accurate so that when he would shout at the referee at the football matches, he could be certain that 90 minutes had actually been played. They agreed on the engraving, and that went to an engraver's in Shrewsbury, and then went into a big safe in Swindon. Well, 3 months before his retirement, Charlie developed a cough. It was a bit more than a cough. It was his lungs. The coal was coming back to get him. All the children were summoned. Even their eldest daughter was called back from Germany. But he'd gone by the end of the month. The men from the railway board came to talk to his widow. They were very solicitous. There's nothing to worry about, Mrs. Lambourne, they said. Nothing to worry about at all. The pension will be still paid. You can stay here. But there is the slight matter of the pocket watch. It's regulations, you see. He didn't actually do the 30 years, so we'll have to keep that. So the watch stayed in a big safe in Swindon. At the moment, there are 1 Lambourne left living in Oswestry. All the others have moved away. She's Marjorie, Malcolm's widow. And she has 3 graves to tend to. Malcolm's, her parents, and of course, Charlie and Beattie's. And once a year, her nephew comes up. He brings a potted plant. And he talks about cleaning this headstone. The composite stone has greyed very badly. You could barely read it. It's the railwaymen's cottages, the fires from there that's blackened them so. Marjorie is not so happy about having it cleaned. They go to the newer parts of the cemetery where the stones are shining black and cut by laser. The lettering is gold and silver, and sometimes there are pictures. And nobody wants just a name and dates and an RIP. They want everything. They want father, son, brother, uncle, friend, a colleague. Marjorie turns to her nephew and says, if you don't mind, I would like the gravestone to stay as it is. The nephew agrees. And Stephen, she says, would you like to come back to the house for a bite? Stephen says, I will, Auntie Marjorie. I will. Thank you.